The only real difference between him and Basil is that he was small and had a very large hen-pecking wife.
So I didn't have any problems with saying what I didn't think was funny. No, I don't believe that. Why does he say that?
Imagine creating one of the most beloved British sitcoms of all time, producing only 12 episodes, and somehow leaving behind a scene so controversial that people would still be arguing about it nearly 50 years later. That is exactly what happened with Fawlty Towers. The series was built around bad manners, disastrous decisions, impossible guests, and one hotel manager who seemed physically incapable of keeping his temper under control. But there was one episode that became different from all the others. It wasn't simply remembered as funny. It became controversial. It was criticized, defended, edited, and repeatedly reconsidered as attitudes toward comedy changed. The episode was The Germans, and at the center of the storm was Basil Fawlty's infamous obsession with the Second World War. But here's the part many people miss. The controversy didn't happen in isolation. To understand why that episode became so famous, you first have to understand where Basil Fawlty came from, and the bizarre real-life hotel manager who helped inspire him. The man who inspired Basil Fawlty. Long before Basil was screaming behind a hotel reception desk, John Cleese had an unforgettable experience in Torquay. In 1970, members of the Monty Python team traveled there while working on Monty Python's Flying Circus. They stayed at the Gleneagles Hotel, and the hotel's manager, Donald Sinclair, left an impression. Sinclair apparently had an unusual way of dealing with guests. Instead of treating every customer as someone who should be kept happy, he could behave as though the guests themselves were the problem. He was suspicious. He could be unpredictable. And according to stories later associated with the Python stay, even ordinary behavior could trigger an extraordinary response. One of the most famous incidents involved Eric Idle. Idle had left his briefcase in the hotel lobby. A normal hotel manager might have simply asked around to find its owner. Sinclair reportedly did something very different. He became convinced the briefcase might contain a bomb and threw it over a garden wall. Think about that for a moment. A guest leaves a briefcase behind. The manager doesn't put it somewhere safe. He doesn't ask whose it is. He throws it away because he suspects it could explode. For a comedian like John Cleese, this wasn't just strange. It was comedy material waiting to happen. And there were other stories. Terry Gilliam reportedly attracted Sinclair's attention because of the way he was using his knife and fork. Sinclair apparently felt the need to intervene and correct him. Complaints from guests could reportedly receive similarly unconventional treatment. Instead of creating a calm and welcoming environment, the manager seemed capable of turning minor problems into dramatic confrontations. Cleese watched. He remembered. And eventually, those memories became Basil Fawlty. Basil wasn't really Donald Sinclair. It's tempting to imagine that Basil Fawlty was simply Donald Sinclair with a different name. He wasn't. Cleese and Connie Booth took the basic inspiration and exaggerated it enormously. Basil became a man obsessed with social status. He wanted wealthy guests. He wanted respect. He wanted people to believe his hotel was sophisticated. Most importantly, he wanted to believe that he was sophisticated. But Basil had one enormous problem. He was terrible at almost everything he cared about. The more desperate he became to look respectable, the more ridiculous he appeared. His temper constantly betrayed him. His insecurity made him suspicious. And his attempts to control other people usually created even greater disasters. That combination made him perfect for television. But John Cleese's journey toward creating Basil had begun long before his stay at the Gleneagles. The making of John Cleese. John Cleese grew up in Weston-super-Mare and was an only child. His father, Reginald Cheese, changed the family surname to Cleese in the 1920s. Young John was unusually tall, even as a teenager. By the age of 13, he was already more than 6 feet tall, giving him a naturally awkward physical presence that would later become useful in comedy. But there was more to Cleese than his appearance. He was academically talented and developed a fascination with language, behavior, and the strange ways people interacted with one another. Even as a schoolboy, he had a taste for unusual humor. At Clifton College, he reportedly pulled off a prank involving a statue of Field Marshal Haig. Cleese created painted footprints leading away from the statue, making it appear as though the statue had somehow walked away. It was childish. It was absurd. And it contained the basic ingredient of Cleese's future comedy. Take something completely ordinary and make it ridiculous. But Cleese's school years weren't entirely carefree. At 17, he was disappointed after being passed over for a house prefect position despite doing well academically. Experiences like that helped shape his attitude toward authority and fairness. And later, his comedy would repeatedly target people who took themselves far too seriously. That became one of his trademarks. From law to comedy, Cleese eventually made his way to Cambridge. He studied law at Downing College, but his future wasn't going to involve courtrooms. At Cambridge, he became involved with the famous Footlights Theatre Club. According to the story, when he was asked whether he could sing or dance, Cleese's answer was essentially no. But he could make people laugh. That was enough. At Footlights, he met people who would become important figures in British comedy, including Graham Chapman, Tim Brooke-Taylor, and Bill Oddie. Cleese's style was beginning to emerge. He had the height. He had the voice. He had the timing. And he had an unusual ability to turn ordinary social behavior into something completely absurd. Eventually, he would become one of the central figures behind Monty Python. And Monty Python would eventually lead him back to that strange hotel in Torquay, turning a bad hotel into a great sitcom. The idea behind Fawlty Towers sounds simple when you describe it. A dysfunctional hotel manager runs a struggling hotel while constantly battling guests, employees, his wife, and his own personality. But the brilliance came from the execution. Cleese and Connie Booth didn't simply create Basil. They built an entire ecosystem around him. There was Sybil Fawlty, Basil's formidable wife. There was Polly, the capable employee who often had to clean up the messes Basil created. And there was Manuel, the enthusiastic Spanish waiter whose misunderstandings regularly made Basil's already terrible day even worse. Every character had a specific role. Every misunderstanding could trigger another. And every attempt Basil made to restore order usually produced another disaster. When the BBC first broadcast Fawlty Towers in 1975, however, the response wasn't universally enthusiastic. Some critics didn't immediately understand the frantic style. The show moved quickly. Characters shouted over one another. Situations escalated almost impossibly fast. To some viewers, it seemed chaotic. But audiences gradually discovered what made it special. The chaos wasn't random. It was carefully constructed. Every misunderstanding led somewhere. Every character reaction created another problem. And Basil was at the center of all of it. The show almost didn't get a second chance. The first series contained only 6 episodes, and the BBC wasn't immediately convinced that another series was necessary. But something happened that changed everything. Reruns began attracting larger audiences. People who had initially ignored the show started discovering it. Word spread. Basil Fawlty became recognizable. And suddenly, the program that had seemed too strange to some critics was becoming one of Britain's most popular sitcoms. A second series eventually arrived in 1979. Then it ended. That was it. 12 episodes. No massive 20-year run. No endless déclin. No dozens of increasingly desperate seasons. Just 12 episodes. And yet those 12 episodes became enough to secure Fawlty Towers a permanent place in television history. The strange situation behind Series 2. There was another unusual story happening behind the scenes. By the time the second series was being made, John Cleese and Connie Booth had divorced. They had been married while creating the original series, but their relationship had ended by the time production continued. Yet they still worked together. They remained focused on the show, and their personal difficulties didn't prevent them from completing the second and final series. That makes the finished episodes even more remarkable. The hotel on screen was falling apart. The characters were constantly losing control. And behind the scenes, the show's creators were navigating their own complicated circumstances. But the work continued, and eventually came the episode that would become the most controversial of them all. The Germans. The setup sounds almost harmless. Basil has suffered a blow to the head. A group of German tourists arrives at the hotel, and Basil becomes determined not to offend them. So he gives his staff one very clear instruction: don't mention the war. Of course, anyone who knows Basil Fawlty already knows exactly what is going to happen next. The man who tells everyone not to discuss the war becomes the person most incapable of avoiding it. Basil begins making references to the Second World War. He becomes increasingly agitated. He tries to manage the situation, and, as usual, his attempts at control make everything worse. Eventually, he performs an exaggerated Nazi-style imitation. It is deliberately ridiculous. It is uncomfortable, and it became one of the most recognizable moments in British sitcom history. But the question is, was the scene making fun of the Germans, or was it making fun of Basil? That distinction became the entire argument. Those who defended the episode pointed out that Basil was clearly the fool. He isn't presented as intelligent. He isn't presented as admirable. His behavior is embarrassing. The scene exposes his ignorance and arrogance. But critics weren't necessarily persuaded. For some viewers, the subject was simply too serious for this kind of comedy. The Second World War was still within living memory when the episode originally aired. For families who had experienced the conflict, jokes about Hitler and Nazi Germany could carry a very different emotional weight. And that meant the same scene could produce completely opposite reactions. One person could see a ridiculous character humiliating himself. Another could see an uncomfortable subject being turned into entertainment. That tension never completely disappeared. When the episode returned, years after the original broadcast, Fawlty Towers entered a new era. The show was no longer simply being watched by British television audiences. It was being replayed internationally, released on home video, and eventually made available through modern streaming platforms. That meant old jokes were reaching new audiences with completely different cultural expectations. The Germans became particularly vulnerable to re-examination. Some versions were edited. Some broadcasts removed material. And fans began arguing that changing the episode destroyed its original context. Others argued that broadcasters had every right to reconsider material that modern audiences might find offensive. Suddenly, the old episode had become part of a much larger discussion. Where does satire end? When does offensive material stop being acceptable? And should comedy created decades ago be judged by the standards of its original era, or by the standards of the audience watching it today? Those questions would keep the controversy alive long after the hotel itself had closed its fictional doors. And the story becomes even more interesting when you look at what happened to the people who created it. Because behind all the screaming, slammed doors, frying pans, and ridiculous misunderstandings was a cast that sometimes paid a surprisingly high price for the comedy. And one actor in particular discovered that playing man well could be a lot more painful than audiences ever realized. The controversy surrounding the Germans didn't end when the episode finished. In fact, it became one of the most debated parts of Fawlty Towers. The episode featured Basil Fawlty trying desperately to avoid offending his German guests. His famous instruction was simple: don't mention the war. Naturally, Basil couldn't follow his own advice. Before long, he was making increasingly awkward references to the Second World War and performing an exaggerated Nazi-style imitation. For some viewers, the scene was brilliant because Basil was clearly the fool. The joke wasn't really about the Germans. It was about Basil's ignorance, arrogance, and inability to control himself. But others felt the subject was simply too serious for comedy. The Second World War was still within living memory when the episode originally aired, and for many families, the subject carried painful personal memories. That disagreement followed the episode for decades. As Fawlty Towers reached new audiences through repeats, home video, and streaming, some broadcasters and platforms reconsidered controversial material. Parts of the episode were edited or removed in certain versions, leading to another wave of debate. Fans argued that changing the episode removed the context. Critics argued that comedy doesn't exist outside the culture of its time. And that's why the Germans remain so interesting. It forces viewers to ask whether satire should be judged by the intention of the writer or by the reaction of the audience. Behind the laughs, the production itself had plenty of drama. Andrew Sachs, who played Manuel, reportedly suffered a painful bruise when a real frying pan was used during an early take of one scene. Safer props were later introduced. Prunella Scales, meanwhile, turned Sybil Fawlty into one of British television's most intimidating characters. And behind the scenes, John Cleese and Connie Booth were dealing with their own complicated situation. The two had divorced by the time the second series was made, yet they continued working together professionally. Their collaboration produced the final 6 episodes. Then Fawlty Towers ended. Only 12 episodes had ever been made. Why the show stayed so popular? Stopping after 12 episodes may have been one of the smartest decisions the creators made. There was no long decline, no endless repetition. The series simply ended while the characters were still at their best. Basil remained the same impossible hotel manager. Sybil remained terrifying. Polly remained the voice of reason, and Manuel remained hopelessly confused. John Cleese went on to a huge career in film and television, while Connie Booth largely stepped away from acting. But neither could completely escape the legacy of Fawlty Towers. Basil Fawlty had become bigger than the show itself, the real reason it still matters. So, did the Germans actually take Fawlty Towers off the air? No, that's the important part. The episode became controversial, but the series wasn't canceled because of it. The creators simply stopped after 2 series and 12 episodes. And somehow, that tiny collection of episodes became one of Britain's most celebrated sitcoms. In 2000, the British Film Institute ranked Fawlty Towers as the greatest British television series. Even today, people still quote Basil, imitate his temper, and debate the show's most controversial moments. That's the strange legacy of Fawlty Towers. It didn't just make people laugh. It made people uncomfortable. It made people argue. And it proved that sometimes the characters who behave the worst can create the most unforgettable comedy. Basil Fawlty may have wanted to run the perfect hotel. Instead, he created television history.